In this video, we're going to get started on integrating JavaScript into HTML. All we're really going to do is learn how to use JavaScript to print something to an HTML document, effectively displaying it in the browser, right? Because HTML is ultimately rendered in some type of browser. We're talking like Chrome, Firefox, or something like that. Our short-term goal is to be able to get user input and make more dynamic programs that way. Now, we could use Scanner, something like Scanner, I should say, which is what we did when we're working with Java, right? We're getting user input via the console, and they're actually like typing things in. You can do that with JavaScript, but that's really not the route we want to go, because we'd be learning how to do that just to do a couple of programs and then migrating to HTML anyway. But B, JavaScript's meant to be used with HTML, right? The whole point it exists is to allow you to kind of more dynamically edit HTML code. So we're going to start working our way towards that short-term goal. Let's get started. We're going to kind of demonstrate this by working through a new project called TempCoverter. The idea is going to be very simple. We take a Fahrenheit temperature, convert it to Celsius. Okay, so here I am in Visual Studio Code, and I want to basically set up a project folder, a working directory. A couple of different ways. We can click on Open Folder. It'll trigger the process. Or we can go to File, Open Folder. These do the same thing. Here I am in my CSR folder. Is going to be like my root directory for where I put all my little sub-projects in. Right? This is in C drive users, my username, as generated by Windows, and CSR. Okay? So I have swapped to this folder for one major big brain reason. Long term, we're going to start using command prompt for certain things, right? When we start working with React a little bit later on, we're going to be using command prompt. And you saw I just launched a command prompt here, and the default directory that it's always going to launch to is C users and then my username. So by creating our kind of code folder here in a centralized location, it's a very quick to actually get to that directory. I can just do just a few change directories. That's what CD stands for, right? Change directory, CSR, and boom, I'm there, right? If I want to get into this Hello World folder that you see on your screen, I can change directory, Hello World, and I'm there. So that is ultimately the reason why I have kind of moved my subfolder or my coding folder to this directory. I don't know what I'm doing. Okay, so here I am. We're still trying to set up our project. I'm in my CSR folder. I want to make a new folder here called TempCoverter. It's going to store my code for our TempCoverter program. I'm going to, once I've created that folder, select it, and Visual Studio Code is going to basically set that as my working directory, like we see this up here. I'm ready to get started on making some files, okay? There's a couple of ways. You can go to File, New File. I don't quite like that because it just like launches the new window without really naming anything. What I prefer instead is to hover over our directory here, TempCoverter directory, and there's a New File icon. I like clicking that one because it gives me an opportunity to go ahead and name the file. And what we're going to name it is index.html. I actually talked about in the last video why you want to do index.html. Ultimately, all the websites that you encounter have index.html, right? If I go to google.com, right, this URL, what's actually omitted here, what you don't see is what we're actually accessing is index.html, right? If I type in this and I hit enter, we end up at the exact same page. It's because it's the exact same thing. Effectively, this is like the landing page for every web page, right? Every website has an index.html, and whenever you type in a URL, it's actually shortcutting this process and looking for index.html on that web page. So this is going to be like the start for every site that we ultimately make. And I'm going to go ahead and plug in our HTML skeleton, right? Using the IntelliSense here, I'm going to select HTML5, and it's going to create our HTML skeleton. I'm going to highlight these boys and tab them over because I like it. But a couple things here. None of this is super important to us right now, but we have a head. This is where metadata goes. Old school search engines, we're talking pre-Google, you would put like search engine tags up here, and that's how they knew how to find your website. One thing that's going to be important pretty shortly is just the title. This is just what shows up on like a tab, and I'll show you that in just a moment. Okay, most of our code is going to happen here in the body. Right? This is an HTML, so I'm going to throw in some HTML tags. If you don't know what these HTML tags are, don't worry about it. They're very simple and straightforward. This is a heading tag. I'm going to say, welcome. Why don't we say like something like, welcome to TempCoverter. Okay. I actually have something that I'm able to execute and render in a browser. So a couple of different ways. My personal favorite way is to maybe just right click and do reveal in file explorer. Right, that's going to basically bring up the folder where this is at, and you see I have my index.html. Because it's an HTML file, it can be rendered in a web browser such as Chrome. You see the Chrome icon. I'm going to double click on it, and it's going to open that in Chrome. Welcome to TempCoverter. Man, that's huge. Okay, so this is actually, right, instead of a website URL, we're just rendering the file here locally. But it says, welcome to TempCoverter. I'd like you to also notice it says document right here. That's because it says document right here. Okay, so this is that title. This is where it becomes relevant, right? Titles they show up on the tab as we see here, but it's also like what gets saved if we were to like bookmark this, right? It's going to save it as document. So that's the only reason why that tends to be relevant. I'm going to come in here and let's call this TempCoverter. Ta-da! All of this is just like nifty little formatting stuff. Okay. Let's get to the meat of it, which is I want to basically use JavaScript to put things onto the web page. The way we're going to do that is with this HTML script tag. I'm going to have an opening and closing script tag. Anything that appears in between here is JavaScript code, and you're telling the HTML to be on the lookout for it. Okay, well, let's start with something simple, some JavaScript that we know. Console.log. Hello world. Let's use single quotes. Hello world. Okay, I'm going to save it. I'm going to flip back to my file, and I'm going to refresh it because I've made changes. So it's going to reload that index.html. We see that it now says TempCoverter on our tag or a tab because we changed the title. But where's my hello world console log thing? Well, as it turns out, like we're logging to the console. We're not logging to the HTML web page. And you can actually see this. Almost every modern day browser, it includes a way to inspect the page, right? To look at the code that's behind. So we're going to do that now. I'm in Chrome. I'm going to right click and click inspect, and it's going to bring up these things. We actually see our elements, our HTML page, right? The head. We wrote all this, kind of. We see our title, TempCoverter, absolutely. Oh yeah, H1, welcome to TempCoverter. We wrote that. Here's our script, console.log. There's actually this console tab up here that'll show us, there's my hello world. Okay, case in point, console.log, it does log to the console. That's just not how we render things on the HTML page. So the question is then, how do we do that? I'm back in Visual Studio Code, and simply put, we're going to need a landing spot for this, right? If I'm going to print, I need to tell it to print where, because eventually there's multiple places that you can effectively print to. So what I'm going to do, notice I'm outside the script tags, I'm inside the body, I'm going to create a paragraph tag. Right? It doesn't necessarily matter what tag that you're working with. Like later on, this is maybe like a div tag, but here's a paragraph tag. It's an existing HTML element. Okay, if I was to create this tag and write hi, we can go back to our code, we can refresh it, and boom, there it is, hi. It's not in the header tag, it's in a paragraph tag, which is why it kind of appears below, and it's not as large as this header tag. So what I'm going to do next is take that paragraph tag, and I need to basically tell my script to put text here. The way we need to do that is we actually need to give this thing an ID. It's almost like it's a variable. We're going to tag it with an ID. Right? I'm saying the ID on this paragraph tag is, I don't know, output. Notice that I'm using double quotes here. That's the only option in HTML. In JavaScript, you can choose single quotes or double quotes whenever you're talking about strings or quoted text. It is recommended that we use double quotes because that's our only option for HTML. Because that's the only option for HTML, we can save ourselves some frustration by using single quotes when working with JavaScript. Okay, so I have tagged this paragraph with an ID of output. And what I want to do is tell my JavaScript to print stuff here. And the way I'm going to do that is with a simple document dot get element by ID. This is a method that ultimately is going to take in some type of ID. Notice it says right here a string. Well, the string I'm going to give it is output. I wonder if we can do single quotes. We should be able to do single quotes, right? It's our JavaScript, right? I want to pull our document, our HTML. I want to get an element by its ID. This is an element, right? And this is an element. I want to get the element by ID, in this case, output. And I want to change the inner HTML to something. This effectively is just a variable. Right? It's this section right here. I want to change this to something. Why don't we say, hello world. Let's try that out. I'm going to flip back to my page. I'm going to refresh it, and boom, there's our text. I got the question when I was doing this live on how do we keep the text that's there, right? Hi was there, and I've edited that section to hello world, right? I am replacing what's there. The question is, well, how do I keep what's there? And the answer is, since this is basically a variable, right? I'm updating this to this. Because it's a variable, I can instead change what it is to what it was plus something new. And I'm going to throw in a space here so we can differentiate those things, right? I want this thing, this variable, this, I want that to become what it was, which is hi, plus this. Right? I have saved my file. I'm going to flip back. I'm going to tell it to refresh. And there you see we get to keep the hi, and we're tacking on this hello world. Okay. Now likely you've seen something similar to this when working with Java. We actually can shorthand syntax this. I can replace this effectively with a plus equals operator. That's the exact same thing. What I just had and using this plus equals operator is the exact same thing. And I'm going to save my file, flip back to Chrome, tell it to refresh, and you see we're still working. That's effectively it for now. Like, we're just using JavaScript to display to a web browser. And I know what you're thinking. This is kind of silly, right? That's really all you've accomplished by like printing things. This gets way more powerful. What I'm showing you is that we can embed JavaScript directly into an HTML file. This is JavaScript code, but this is all HTML. So in the middle of the HTML, we have JavaScript code that is able to operate. Now, the moment that you get JavaScript code, keep in mind the whole reason we want JavaScript is it's going to add more advanced things like conditionals, that is if statements. We'll be able to add loops. And so what we'll be able to do long term is come in here, and instead of simply just doing this simple text, we can add a whole bunch of logic here, right? We can plug in loops. And then maybe those loops are editing strings that are ultimately, getting larger and larger and larger, and that's what we end up setting our inner HTML to. So this looks simple at first, but the possibilities, you want me to say endless, don't you? They're endless. I'll see you in the next video.